The night she was sold, the moon hid behind clouds as if it didn't want to witness the bargain either. And years later people would swear that was the first sign something powerful had shifted, because destinies like hers never move quietly. If stories about women being discarded for their bodies make your blood boil, or if you believe worth is more than what the world decides it is, then you'll want to stay with this one. And if you agree with that belief as this story unfolds, go ahead and like and subscribe, because what begins here refuses to stay small. They called her infertile like it was a crime. Not softly, not gently, but with the sharp certainty of people who had already rewritten her future without asking her permission. Alara was 22 when the doctor's words settled into her parents' bones like cold cement, and from that moment on, she was no longer a daughter so much as a failed investment. In their world, tight-knit, tradition-soaked, and obsessed with lineage, a woman's body was a promise, and Alara's had been declared empty. Her mother cried for exactly one night, more for the loss of grandchildren than for the girl herself, and her father grew quiet in a way that meant numbers were already forming behind his eyes. Debts had a way of becoming louder when hope disappeared, and Alara's condition turned into the final excuse they needed. They stopped asking where she was going, stopped including her in conversations, stopped pretending the house still belonged to her. When the men arrived, it felt almost orderly. Papers, signatures, a dowry flipped on its head. Alara stood between her parents like a piece of furniture being evaluated, her spine straight not because she was brave, but because she refused to fold in front of them. She learned something vital in that moment. Being unwanted doesn't always come with shouting. It often comes with calm efficiency. The deal was simple. A family with influence needed a woman who wouldn't complicate inheritance lines, and Alara's parents needed money that didn't ask questions. She wasn't told where she was going at first, only that she should be grateful someone still wanted her at all. That word, wanted, echoed bitterly as the car pulled away from the only home she had known, her mother already counting the cash in her head, her father relieved in a way that hurt more than anger ever could. Alara expected cruelty. She expected to be locked into a life of quiet humiliation, maybe as a wife who would always be blamed for what she could never give. What she did not expect was the man who interrupted the arrangement entirely. The warehouse where the exchange was meant to finalize fell silent when he arrived, not because he raised his voice, but because power clung to him like gravity. His name was Victor Calvano, and people said it the way they said storms, carefully, with respect for the damage it could do. He didn't look at Alara like merchandise. He looked at her like a problem already solved, and that terrified her more than pity ever could. Victor Calvano was a widower, though the word felt too small for the weight he carried. He ruled his empire with discipline sharpened by grief, and everyone knew his greatest vulnerability wasn't his rivals, it was his 4 daughters. Motherless, watched by guards instead of bedtime stories, they were the one soft spot enemies whispered about. Victor had learned that softness needed strategy. He didn't want a lover. He didn't want another woman competing for space in his children's lives. He wanted someone the world underestimated, someone no one would suspect of ambition, someone who couldn't be accused of scheming for heirs. Alara's so-called flaw made her invisible in the most useful way, so he rewrote the terms with a calm that left no room for debate. She wasn't being bought as a bride. She was being taken as a caretaker, a presence, a stabilizing force. Her parents didn't even ask what that meant. They agreed before the sentence was finished. Alara felt the final thread snap then, not grief, not shock, just a clean severing of attachment. Whatever waited ahead, it would be hers alone. The estate was nothing like she imagined. No excess noise, no gold-plated absurdity. It was quiet in the way places become when children learn not to ask for things. For girls watched her arrival from a staircase like weary sentries. The oldest, Alessia, had her father's eyes and none of his restraint. The second, Mara, barely looked up from her book, already armored in detachment. The third, twin flames of mischief and sadness named Sophia and Lila, clung to each other with the intensity of children who had learned people disappeared without warning. Alara felt the weight of their judgment immediately. She was another adult who would fail them, another temporary figure. Victor didn't introduce her with affection. He introduced her with purpose. This is Alara. She will be staying. He didn't ask the girls to accept her. He didn't ask Alara if she was ready. He simply placed them in the same orbit and stepped back to observe what would happen. At night, Alara lay awake in a room larger than her childhood apartment, listening to the echoes of a household still holding its breath. She realized something then that would shape everything that followed. She had been sold because she was considered empty, but this house was starving. Not for bloodlines, not for heirs, but for someone who would stay when it hurt. She didn't know yet that Victor watched from a distance, noting how she didn't raise her voice, how she spoke to the girls like they mattered, how she never once tried to claim a role she hadn't earned. She didn't know enemies were already paying attention, or that choosing her would ripple outward in ways no one could predict. All she knew was that she had crossed a threshold where being unwanted no longer defined her. And in a world built on power, that was the most dangerous transformation of all. By the time Alara understood the rules of Victor Calvano's house, she also understood that none of them were written down. Power didn't announce itself here. It settled into corners, into pauses between sentences, into the way people waited for Victor to speak even when he wasn't in the room. The first weeks passed like a careful dance. The staff treated her politely but distantly, as if she were a temporary fixture that could be removed at any moment. The guards barely acknowledged her, except to watch, always watch. And the girls made it clear she was on trial. Alessia challenged her openly, questioning every instruction, every boundary, her sharp words designed to cut and expose weakness. Mara stayed quiet, but silence, Alara learned, could be sharper than shouting. Sophia and Lila tested her in smaller ways, hiding her things, whispering lies to see if she would react, waiting for the inevitable moment she would snap or leave. Alara didn't correct them the way their tutors did. She didn't threaten consequences. She simply remained. When Alessia stormed out of her room, Alara didn't chase her, but she was there when Alessia came back. When Mara refused to speak, Alara sat beside her anyway, reading aloud, as if the silence were companionship rather than rejection. It was exhausting in a way no physical labor had ever been, because patience asked for parts of her she didn't know she still possessed. Victor watched all of it without interference. He told himself it was caution, that attachment was dangerous, that this woman was here for a function and nothing more. But he found himself noticing things that had nothing to do with efficiency. How Alara remembered which cup each child preferred without being told. How she knelt to speak at their eye level instead of towering over them. How she never flinched at their anger, as if she recognized it as something familiar rather than threatening. At night, when his work dragged him into violence and negotiation, he returned to a house that no longer felt like a mausoleum. There was noise now, quiet laughter, arguments over homework, the sound of footsteps running down hallways that had once echoed only with his own. It unsettled him more than gunfire ever had. He had built his life on control, and Alara was changing things without asking permission. The first crack appeared when Sophia was injured. It was small, scraped knees from climbing a forbidden wall, but the reaction was not. The guards panicked, protocols triggered, radios crackling as if a war had broken out. Victor arrived to find Alara already cleaning the wound, Sophia gripping her sleeve with white-knuckled fear. Alara didn't move when Victor entered. She didn't step aside. She simply looked up and said, calmly, "She's scared. Yelling will make it worse." For a fraction of a second, the room froze. No one spoke to Victor Calvano like that. No one corrected him. He should have been furious. Instead, he felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was locked tight. He waved the guards away. Later, alone in his study, he replayed the moment again and again, not the injury, but the instinct. Alara hadn't protected Sophia because it was her job. She had protected her because that was what you did when someone you cared about was hurt. The distinction mattered more than Victor was ready to admit. Rumors began quietly, as they always did. Whispers among the men about the woman in the house. Questions about why the boss seemed less volatile, why meetings ended earlier, why his daughters were suddenly seen laughing in public. To the outside world, it looked like weakness. To Victor, it felt like standing too close to the edge of something precious and fragile. He doubled security. He shortened his temper. He told himself this was temporary, that Alara was a solution, not a complication. But solutions don't usually invade your thoughts at inconvenient hours. Solutions don't make you hesitate before pulling a trigger or consider the future beyond survival. Alara did all of that without ever touching his work. She never asked what he did, never judged, never pretended ignorance either. She accepted the darkness as part of the landscape, the same way she had accepted her parents' betrayal, as something that existed, not something she could wish away. The girls changed faster than Victor expected. Alessia's defiance softened into wary respect. She began asking Alara questions she had never asked anyone else, about choices, about mistakes, about whether it was possible to be strong without becoming cruel. Mara started leaving her book open when Alara entered the room, a small but seismic shift. Sophia and Lila stopped testing her limits and started testing her trust, bringing secrets instead of pranks. Alara carried those secrets carefully, never using them as leverage, never betraying the fragile faith being built. And that, Victor realized too late, was what truly bound his daughters to her. In a world where everything was transactional, Alara gave them something that didn't come with strings. The danger arrived disguised as concern. Victor's cousin and second-in-command, Matteo, voiced what others were thinking but were afraid to say. He spoke of optics, of perception, of enemies who would exploit any sign of softness. He mentioned Alara's past in a way that sounded like caution but felt like accusation. A woman sold by her family. A woman with nothing to lose. Victor dismissed him publicly, but the seed was planted. When a shipment was intersected. When a meeting location was compromised. When a rival family made a move that suggested inside knowledge, eyes turned, not openly, but inevitably, toward the one variable that didn't belong. Alara felt the shift before anyone spoke to her. The staff grew colder. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Alessia noticed too, her anger flaring in defense, which only fueled suspicion. Victor said nothing, but the silence between him and Alara grew heavier, weighted with questions neither of them wanted to ask. The breaking point came on a night that should have been ordinary. Dinner had ended. The girls were arguing over a movie. Alara was laughing, actually laughing, when the power went out. Not a flicker. A clean, intentional blackout. Alarms followed seconds later. Gunfire echoed against stone. Chaos exploded through the estate. Training took over for Victor, but instinct took over for Alara. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't look for permission. She gathered the girls and moved, shielding them with her body as they ran, guiding them into a hidden room she'd memorized despite never being shown. When a door splintered and shadows filled the hallway, Alara stepped forward, heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard, and stood between the threat and the children. In that moment, there was no calculation, no fear of consequence, only certainty. Whatever she had been sold as, whatever the world thought she lacked, she was not empty. She was full of something fierce and unmovable. Victor found them minutes later, the attack already neutralized, blood staining marble floors. He saw Alara first, unarmed, trembling, unbroken. Then his daughters clinging to her, as if she were the only solid thing left. Something in him shifted irreversibly. Whatever doubts had been planted, whatever suspicions lingered, they could not survive that image. But elsewhere in the estate, someone was already preparing to twist the night's events into a weapon. Because in Victor Calvano's world, saving his daughters didn't make Alara untouchable. It made her dangerous. By morning, the estate looked the same as it always had. Marble polished, guards posted, order restored. But the lie of normalcy fooled no one. Blood had a way of leaving echoes, and the night's violence had carved a permanent line through Victor Calvano's world. Alara felt it in the way people avoided her eyes, in the way conversations resumed only after she passed, in the way safety now felt conditional. The girls stayed close, instinctively orbiting her like planets clinging to a new sun, and that alone was enough to seal her fate. In Victor's world, love was leverage, attachment was exposure, and Alara had become both without ever intending to. Matteo made his move before the sun reached its peak, presenting his concerns in the language of loyalty and survival. He spoke of risk, of infiltration, of coincidences that no longer felt coincidental. He didn't accuse Alara directly. That would have been crude. Instead, he let implication do the work, laying out timelines, connections, just enough doubt to force Victor into a corner where hesitation itself became dangerous. The house waited. The men watched. The code demanded an answer. Victor summoned Alara not as the man who had watched her protect his children, but as the leader who could not afford uncertainty. The room was cold despite the sunlight pouring in, its warmth useless against the tension coiled between them. He asked her questions that were less about truth and more about permission. Permission to believe, permission to forgive, permission to defy the rules that had kept him alive this long. Alara listened without interrupting, her face calm in a way that came not from confidence, but from exhaustion. When he finished, she didn't plead. She didn't defend herself with tears or promises. She told him the truth, stripped of drama. She told him she had been sold once already by people who should have protected her, and she would not beg another man to see her worth. She told him she loved his daughters, not strategically, not carefully, but completely, and if that made her a liability, then so be it. Then she did the unthinkable. She offered to leave. No bargaining, no conditions, just an open door and the quiet dignity of someone who refused to be traded again. The room went still. Victor felt the weight of every decision he had ever made press down on him at once. He saw, with brutal clarity, the difference between power that controls and power that protects. Mateo had given him logic. Alara had given him truth. And truth, Victor realized, was far rarer and far more dangerous. He dismissed her without a verdict, a move that infuriated his men and confused everyone else. But confusion bought time, and time gave him space to see what had been hiding in plain sight. With help from the few he trusted completely, Victor unraveled Mateo's careful web. Money trails surfaced. Messages intersected. A pattern emerged, not of coincidence, but of orchestration. Mateo hadn't feared Alara's influence. He had intended to use it. He had engineered the attack, the blackout, the doubt, all to force Victor into eliminating the one person who had changed the house, and then step forward as the man who restored order. It was elegant. It was ruthless. And it was unforgivable. Justice came swiftly, as it always did in Victor Calvano's world. Mateo vanished from conversations, from records, from memory. The house absorbed the lesson in silence. No speeches were made. None were needed. When Victor returned to the garden that evening, he found Alara sitting with the girls beneath the old olive tree, its roots twisted and resilient, surviving decades of storms. She looked up when he approached, not with hope or fear, but with acceptance of whatever came next. Victor did not offer apologies shaped like excuses. He did not ask for forgiveness as if it were owed. He told her she was free, not as a dismissal, but as a declaration. Free to stay or go. Free to choose. The word landed heavier than any chain ever had. Alara looked at the girls, at the way Alessia tried and failed to hide her relief, at Mara's quiet grip on her hand, at Sophia and Lila leaning into her sides as if afraid she might disappear. Choice, she realized, didn't mean absence of fear. It meant ownership of it. She chose to stay. What followed wasn't a fairy tale. Love didn't erase danger, and acceptance didn't soften the world overnight. But the rules of the house changed. Alara was no longer an invisible solution. She was acknowledged, respected, defended. Victor didn't crown her with titles or promises. He did something far more radical. He let her stand beside him, openly. As part of the family he was rebuilding rather than the empire he commanded. The girls flourished in ways no one could have predicted. Alessia learned that strength didn't require cruelty. Mara learned that silence could be shared. Sophia and Lila learned that stability was possible. And Alara learned that being unable to give life had never meant she couldn't shape it. She hadn't been empty. She had been unclaimed. Years later, people would still tell the story wrong. They would say the Mafia boss rescued a broken woman. They would say power chose mercy. They would say love softened a monster. But those who knew the truth understood something deeper. A woman discarded for what she couldn't give had walked into a house starving for what only she possessed. And in choosing to stay, not because she was owned, but because she was wanted, Alara Calvano proved that the most dangerous force in any world ruled by fear is a woman who finally gets to choose herself.